Look at all these SSI benefits, Section 8 benefits, food stamp benefits, and he goes, no, but those are good. But that anecdote captures, right, this dual identity among many Cuban old people, that they're voting Republican, but they're supporting benefits that Republicans are not as supportive as Democrats are. And finally, and this actually goes to an issue we discussed earlier, and an issue that Susan has studied, and that is an issue of identity. Because what's also happening in Miami, as we get into second and third generations, as we have intermarriage between different Latino groups, is Cuban Americans are getting a more Latin identity, a more trans-Latin identity, and bringing in this with the rise of the non-Cuban Hispanic population they're beginning to look for links to other Latino groups and are aware of the issues of the other Latino groups. I mean, even Marco Rubio is married to a Colombian, right? And so we have to keep those demographic changes in mind. What does all this mean? I'll finish. What does all this mean? The two chairs were Puerto Ricans, so we were given a tight leash.
Objection.
But what does all this mean? It means that Republicans are not only going to lose more and more national elections in Florida. I think Florida is on its way to becoming a blue state, from a purple state to a blue state, because of these shifts. But the Republicans, I think, are in danger of losing their control over the state legislature. I think there are 5 legislative seats that are currently held by Cuban Republicans that will switch to Hispanic Democrats over the next 2 election cycles. And one of the seats to watch is 114, which is held by Eric Frezin, a Cuban Republican. And I think that seat will switch by next year, and then 3 others will switch. And the challenge, now this creates a challenge for the Democrats. Because the challenge for the Democrats is, are they going to elect Cuban or other Hispanics as their nominee in these elections? And yesterday, one of the series of elections I were watching was in Miami Beach, where where all the candidates were Democrats, but you had a battle between Jewish Democrats and Cuban Democrats. And if the Democratic Party doesn't, it now gets a second bite of the apple, that as Lisa pointed out, that they had in 1978. If they can recruit young Hispanic, not necessarily Cubans, young Hispanics, Ivy League education or good education, that they will eventually win these seats. If they nominate Anglos, you're going to have the old combination of the 1980s of Cubans and Hispanics coming together to defeat the Anglo-Democrat. So there's a challenge now to both parties. The challenge to the Republican Party is to stop running the 1980 election over, right? That's 24 years, they had enough of a run. 32 years is enough of a run. And the challenge for the Democrats is, in Dade County, to invite Hispanics to the table. Thank you.
So first I want to thank the organizers for this wonderful conference, including Paolo, who's done a wonderful job behind the scenes making this one run so wonderfully. One of the problems of speaking this late is that most of the ideas that you came up with to talk about have already been said, of course more eloquently, including I wanted to talk about critical elections, and there you were talking about that particular issue. Maybe I was actually going to be a little bit more agnostic than you are, so I'm really interested in your stand on that. So essentially, just to talk about where I do plan to talk, first a little bit on the 2012 elections, secondly on the trends over time, third on the significance of the Obama in the 2012 elections, and what is the Obama effect. And then I want to talk about some of the significance of the changing Cuban American vote more broadly. So the exact vote in 2012, we all know by now, is, there is a big debate on what percentage of the Cuban Americans voted for Obama, but I think the general consensus is it was a record number, whatever it was, and then the question is this a trend, or is this just a unique Obama effect, which I will get back to in a second. First, in terms of the trend, and I think that really builds up to what we need to look at, I mean, with some historical eye, yes, there has been an increasing percentage since 2000 in the percentage of Cuban Americans voting Democratic. So there does seem to be some evidence of a trend over time. But if you go back a little bit before, there have been ebbs and flows in the percentage of Cuban Americans that are voting Democratic, which is to suggest there is not a Cuban American vote. There's a propensity, but there is a degree of fluidity within that vote, and it hasn't been unilinear increase over time. Then in terms of, is this sort of Obama exceptionalism, which is part of the issue, we don't know, is it just people like Obama, he's cool, right, as you were saying, and undoubtedly that's a factor, particularly in terms of who he was appealing to, which I will get back to in a second. But if you do look at some of the data, there's reason to think that the leaning Democrat among the Cuban Americans may be more of a long-term trend than a passing sort of Obama exceptionalism. First of all, actually in the primaries in Florida, I believe that Hillary won by a landslide among Cuban Americans, which is to suggest it isn't just Obama that Cuban Americans are attracted to. Admittedly, there's a different group that's voting in the primaries than is voting in the actual elections, but nevertheless it does show that the core of Democrats in the state actually were leaning towards Hillary and not specifically to Obama. And then is the issue if one goes both across the United States and if one goes back over time. And here some of these points have been made. New Jersey. New Jersey has been all along a very different Cuban American story. The Cuban Americans in New Jersey have been voting Democratic. They supported Bob Menendez when he ran for mayor of Union City. They supported him for Congress, and they supported him in the Senate. And so, I mean, that's a hardcore Democrat. So it suggests that there isn't necessarily any sort of essentialist Cuban American proclivity to vote Republican. It is much more contextual, as Lisa was saying, but I would also say, and again it gets to a point that Dario was talking about, that one really needs to look at organization, and it's not just, these trends aren't just explained at the individual level on people's individual propensities. Secondly, if you go back in time, even in Miami, that the first Cuban Americans to get involved in politics actually were Democrats. So it was, 1980 was a critical election year in switching, and you had a lot of Cuban Americans switching their partisan loyalties to the Democrats, including among the sort of a rising political class. So it really already, though, you know, since 1980 is a long period of time, it does suggest that there are other explanations about how Cuban Americans are voting, and it isn't just this intrinsic party loyalty to the Republicans. And so switching occurred then. There's no reason to think that switching might not occur again. Now, why did that switching occur? Well, first of all, why were they Democrats? Take it back a step further. Why were they Democrats in the 1960s? These were these exiles who were coming here, who you would think ideologically would run to the Republican Party. Well, there wasn't much of a Republican Party to run to in the 1960s, and so it was a blue state then, and the Democrats, you know, carried the state. So anybody who was strategic and wanted to get involved in politics, you know, turned to the Democratic Party, just as Bob Menendez did in New Jersey. The reason that New Jersey has been Democratic is it is, you know, northern New Jersey is, you know, run basically by a Democratic machine. So your chances of getting elected, you know, have been much higher if you're going to be affiliated with the Democratic Party here. So in the 60s, that was true here. That did change with Reagan as he ran for office, and as Jeb Bush was appointed head of the Democratic Party of Florida, and Republican Party in Florida, and he was absolutely critical. It wasn't just Reagan, it was the work of Jeb Bush in bringing the Cuban Americans into the Republican Party, and they were rewarded. They were able to get a lot of positions within the Republican Party and get the Republican Party to sort of embrace the issues that they were concerned. Well, that is organization, and as I think Dario very interestingly has pointed out, you know, how long can you run on that 1980 platform? And there does seem, around the edges, I think, some shifting in organizational work going on within the Democratic Party. So, now, in terms of, you know, how to explain the, if this is a critical election, the 2012 election, I mean, I do think you can look at factors that which I've only one really to add that hasn't been mentioned, of factors that may be contributing to this being a critical election. And so, you know, these four factors, I think you said four too, but it's slightly different, are factors that are suggesting a new trend, and maybe this is a critical election. So one is youth, okay? The younger generation does seem to be voting differently. Again, we have to see how long is this going to last, you know. If a young Republican runs for office, then maybe they will start bringing the Republicans, bring the Cuban Americans back to the Republican Party. But it's age, it's generational within the United States. The first versus second, or now increasingly third generation voters are voting differently. And the recent immigrants from Cuba, the post-Soviet era immigrants, really are very different in their mentalities, their experiences in Cuba, and they are coming with those experiences here. They didn't know Cuba before the revolution. They didn't react to, you know, the losses that the exile generation experienced. And so their very different lived experiences are part of who they are when they come here. They don't forget their past. And it does shape how their views are towards Cuba and their behavior towards Cuba, etc. So those are all factors, I think, that are pointing towards possibility that this really is a critical election, that the trends are